The story does not begin with gunfire or speeches, because power rarely announces itself that way. It begins in quiet rooms where the air barely moves, where ceiling fans turn slowly above wooden desks, and where ledger books lie open under tired hands. In these rooms, clerks count numbers that look harmless, orderly, and precise. Ink dries, pages turn, stamps fall with a dull thud. Nothing here suggests violence. And yet, these rooms decide the fate of millions. During the greatest war in human history, while the world watched explosions on distant fronts, the real struggle for survival was happening in accounts and balances far from the battlefield. Britain appeared to fight the war with its own strength, its own factories, its own money. That image still survives today, polished by victory and memory. But beneath the flags and parades lay a hidden war chest, and it was not filled with British gold. It was filled with Indian wealth. At the height of the war, Britain stood as a symbol of defiance. Alone, outnumbered, and under constant threat, it projected resolve to the world. Factories hummed, ships sailed, armies moved across continents. The message was clear: this empire would endure. But endurance has a price, and Britain was running out of money. War consumes resources at a speed no economy can sustain forever. Imports rose, exports fell, reserves drained away. The longer the conflict lasted, the more fragile the financial reality became. Britain needed food, fuel, steel, weapons, and transport on an industrial scale. It needed to pay for them, and it needed to do so without collapsing its currency or surrendering its position at the center of global finance. The question was not whether Britain could fight. It was whether it could afford to keep fighting. The answer did not come from British soil. It came from a land thousands of miles away, under imperial control. India was not an ally negotiating terms. It was a colony with no meaningful voice over its own economy. While bombs fell over Europe and North Africa, India was mobilized as a financial engine. Its factories produced goods. Its fields supplied food. Its ports shipped materials across dangerous seas. Its soldiers filled the ranks of imperial armies. But beyond labor and blood, India provided something even more critical. It provided money, quietly and relentlessly, not as loans freely given, and not as shared sacrifice between equals. This was compulsion. An occupied nation was forced to finance the survival of its occupier. Think about that for a moment. An empire fighting for its life did so by draining the wealth of a people it denied freedom. This story is rarely told because it does not fit the heroic frame of war. It lacks the drama of battle and the clarity of enemies. Instead, it lives in spreadsheets, exchange rates, and deferred payments. It is a story of leverage rather than violence, of obligation rather than choice. Britain did not seize India's wealth in a single dramatic act. It extracted it through systems that looked legal, technical, and even temporary. Payments were postponed. Credits were issued. Balances accumulated. On paper, everything appeared orderly. In reality, India was paying for a war it did not choose, under conditions it could not refuse. The stakes were enormous. Control of global trade routes depended on this flow of resources. The balance of currencies rested on it. The survival of imperial power hinged on numbers recorded in distant offices. From the outside, Britain's war effort appeared heroic and self-sustaining. Newspapers spoke of resilience. Leaders spoke of sacrifice. The empire projected unity, as if all its parts were pulling together by choice. But unity was an illusion maintained by authority. India could not opt out. Its economy was already woven into imperial systems designed for extraction. When the war expanded, those systems tightened. Production quotas rose. Exports increased. Domestic needs were pushed aside. Decisions made in distant capitals reshaped daily life across the subcontinent. Food that could have stabilized local markets was shipped abroad. Goods that could fuel development were redirected to war industries. The cost was hidden at first, absorbed by populations with no mechanism to resist. Britain's financial crisis deepened as the war dragged on. Traditional sources of funding weakened. Foreign investments became uncertain. Gold reserves declined. Borrowing abroad carried risks that could undermine long-term dominance. So Britain turned inward to its empire and outward to India. The mechanism was subtle. Britain purchased goods and services from India, but did not pay in hard currency. Instead, it issued credits recorded in accounts held in London. These credits were promises of future payment, not money that could be spent freely. They accumulated year after year, growing larger with every shipment and every contract. To Britain, this looked like a solution. To India, it was a trap disguised as accounting. What made the system so powerful was its invisibility. There were no headlines announcing seizure or theft. There were no dramatic proclamations. Everything operated within official frameworks. Documents were signed. Orders were issued. Numbers were adjusted. To the untrained eye, it looked like normal imperial administration during wartime. But cause and effect were brutally clear. Britain received real goods. India received paper claims. Britain survived another year of war. India absorbed the inflation, shortages, and strain that followed. This was not partnership. It was forced financing on a massive scale, executed quietly while the world was distracted by battlefields. The moral complexity of war often hides economic truths. Victory stories rarely ask who paid the bill. In this case, the bill was paid by people who never had a seat at the table. Indian workers did not vote on war budgets. Indian farmers did not negotiate export prices. Indian officials operated under imperial authority, bound to comply. The empire's needs came first, always. When shortages emerged, they were framed as unfortunate consequences of war, not as results of deliberate extraction. Responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. No single decision appeared cruel, but together, they formed a system that transferred wealth on an extraordinary scale. As the war intensified, the gap between appearance and reality widened. Britain's public image remained strong, even as its financial position weakened. This contradiction could only be sustained as long as India continued to deliver. Every shipment postponed collapse. Every deferred payment bought time. The empire's war chest grew, not in gold or silver, but in obligations owed to a colony that could not enforce repayment. The longer the war lasted, the deeper the imbalance became. This was a dangerous game. It preserved Britain's immediate survival, while planting the seeds of future instability, both economic and political. The human cost of this system was not immediately visible in balance sheets. It appeared in rising prices, empty shelves, and growing desperation. It appeared in overcrowded cities and strained rural communities. It appeared in the quiet realization that sacrifice was not shared equally. While Britain spoke a collective effort, India experienced imposed burden. The distance between rhetoric and reality widened with every passing year. Trust eroded. Resentment grew. The war effort that was supposed to unite the empire instead exposed its deepest fault lines. This is why this story matters. It challenges a familiar narrative. It forces a different question. When Britain fought for survival, who truly bore the cost? Not in speeches or medals, but in currency and commodities. Not on front lines, but in ports, factories, and fields. The central question is simple, but uncomfortable. Who really paid for Britain's war? And why has that payment been forgotten? This is not a story of villains and heroes in uniform. It is a story of systems that turn power into profit and obligation into silence. To understand the war, one must first understand the ledger. Before the illusion cracked, the British Empire looked unshakable. From a distance, it appeared almost permanent, like a structure too large to fail. London stood at the center of global finance. Its banks trusted across continents. Its currency accepted in ports and markets far from its shores. Insurance contracts, shipping routes, and trade flows all pointed back to the same place. The empire did not just control land, it controlled confidence. And confidence, in the world of money, is power. As long as traders believed in Britain's stability, the system held. As long as the pound was trusted, the empire could move goods, raise funds, and project strength without firing a shot. India was presented as proof of this strength. It was described as productive, stable, and indispensable. A vast territory that supplied raw materials, labor, and markets in return for administration and order. On paper, the arrangement looked efficient. Cotton moved out. Textiles moved in. Wheat left Indian ports while manufactured goods returned. Trade figures were tallied and filed. Everything appeared balanced. Profitable. The empire told a story of mutual benefit, where each part played its role for the greater whole. This narrative was repeated so often that it became accepted truth, even as the imbalance beneath it deepened year by year. When war erupted, the system did not pause. It accelerated. The demand for resources exploded overnight. Armies needed uniforms. Factories needed fuel. Cities needed food. Ships needed steel. Britain's industrial machine shifted into full gear, and India was pulled along with it. Indian factories ran day and night, their output redirected toward wartime needs. Mills that once supplied local markets were now tied to imperial contracts. Railways moved troops and materials instead of people and crops. Ports became arteries of war, pushing supplies outward while drawing little back in return. The empire called this mobilization. It framed it as shared sacrifice. But the direction of sacrifice was never in doubt. Indian soldiers were deployed across distant fronts, fighting in climates and landscapes far from home. Their presence reinforced the image of a unified empire standing together against a common enemy. Newspapers spoke of loyalty and duty. Speeches praised contribution and courage. Yet behind this display of unity lay a deeper reality. Military service was only one part of the contribution. The greater burden was economic, and it was imposed quietly. India's economy was reshaped to serve a war that was not of its choosing, under terms it did not set. From the outside, Britain's war effort seemed remarkably well-funded. Despite years of conflict, production continued. Supply lines held. The pound did not collapse. This apparent financial endurance reinforced the myth of imperial resilience. Observers assumed Britain had vast reserves or limitless access to credit. In reality, those reserves were shrinking fast. Britain's imports soared while its exports struggled. Foreign investments became fragile. Gold reserves thinned. Each year of war increased the risk of financial exhaustion. To admit this weakness would have been dangerous. Confidence had to be maintained at all costs. The solution was already embedded within the empire. India's trade surplus became a lifeline. Goods produced in India were purchased for the war effort, but payment did not take the form of immediate cash. Instead, balances were recorded in imperial accounts. Britain owed India on paper, and those obligations accumulated quietly. The system was framed as temporary, a wartime necessity that would be settled later. Promises were made about post-war adjustment. From a distance, it looked reasonable. After all, the empire was one entity. What mattered was total survival, not internal accounting. But this logic only worked because India had no choice. A sovereign nation might have demanded payment in hard currency. It might have limited exports or negotiated terms. India could do none of that. Its currency was tied to imperial policy. Its trade was regulated by colonial authority. Its financial institutions answered to decisions made elsewhere. When Britain deferred payment, India absorbed the delay. When Britain demanded more, India complied. The illusion of cooperation masked the reality of compulsion. The empire presented this arrangement as strength. Look how much it can mobilize, it said. Look how efficiently resources flow where they are needed. Look how unified we are in crisis. But unity without consent is not unity at all. It is control. The war did not create this imbalance. It exposed it. For decades, India's economy had been structured to serve imperial priorities. The war simply pushed that structure to its limits. What once appeared sustainable became strained. What once looked orderly began to show cracks. The numbers told a reassuring story to those who wanted to believe it. Accounts balanced. Credits were issued. Official statements remained calm. Yet beneath these figures, pressure built. Resources leaving India were real and immediate. The compensation was delayed and uncertain. Domestic markets tightened. Prices began to rise. Goods that once circulated locally were diverted abroad. The empire's needs always came first. The cost of that priority was borne quietly by those with no voice in the decision. Imagine a company forcing its subsidiary to cover every loss indefinitely. No negotiation. No exit. Every deficit absorbed. Every risk transferred downward. That is what the system resembled. Britain shielded itself from immediate financial collapse by pushing the burden onto India's economy. The arrangement preserved imperial stability in the short term, while eroding trust and resilience in the long term. It was not resilience born of strength. It was dependence disguised as dominance. As the war dragged on, this dependence deepened. Each additional year required more supplies, more financing, more sacrifice. Britain's survival became increasingly tied to India's enforced contribution. The illusion held because the machinery of empire functioned smoothly on the surface. Ships sailed. Contracts were fulfilled. Reports were filed. But stability was being purchased at a hidden cost. The longer the war lasted, the harder it became to pretend that this was a fair exchange. This was the calm before the fracture. To the world, Britain still looked like the financial anchor of the Allied effort. To India, the strain was becoming impossible to ignore. The illusion of imperial strength depended on silence, on acceptance, and on the belief that this was temporary. But economic pressure does not remain invisible forever. It builds, it distorts, and eventually it demands reckoning. The empire's image remained intact for now. The question was how long it could last. The cracks did not arrive with an announcement. They appeared quietly, buried beneath official language and stamped documents that looked routine and harmless. Britain did not pay India with gold or freely usable currency. It paid with promises, credits recorded in distant accounts, numbers written into ledgers in London that India could not touch. These balances grew steadily as the war consumed more resources. On paper, India was being compensated. In reality, those credits were locked. They could not be converted at will. They could not be spent on global markets. They could not be used to stabilize prices or import what India desperately needed. They existed in theory, not in practice. This was the core mechanism that sustained Britain's war effort. Each shipment of food, steel, or textiles leaving Indian ports was matched not by immediate payment, but by an entry in an account. Britain received real goods. India received deferred claims. Over time, these claims piled up into enormous sums, impressive in appearance and meaningless in use. Britain framed this as a temporary wartime arrangement. After victory, it said, balances would be settled. Normal trade would resume. Stability would return. But war has a way of turning temporary measures into permanent damage. As demands grew, so did pressure on India's economy. Britain required more supplies each year, more uniforms, more ammunition, more food for troops stationed across the globe. Each request carried the force of authority. Refusal was not an option. India's productive capacity was redirected toward imperial needs, regardless of domestic consequences. Local markets tightened. Goods became scarce. Prices rose steadily, then sharply. Inflation crept into everyday life, eroding purchasing power for millions. Wages lagged behind costs. Savings lost value. The economic strain was no longer abstract. It was felt in households and streets. The imbalance was structural. Britain could issue obligations without immediate cost to itself. India bore the immediate burden. When Britain printed credits, it did not release goods into Indian markets. When India shipped goods, it removed them from circulation at home. One side accumulated paper. The other lost substance. This asymmetry was the hidden engine of the war chest. It allowed Britain to fight a prolonged conflict without collapsing its currency or surrendering its position in global finance. But it did so by exporting instability to its colony. Official language softened the reality. Reports spoke of coordination and contribution. Statistics were framed as evidence of efficiency. Yet beneath these words, the cause and effect chain was unmistakable. Increased exports reduced domestic supply. Reduced supply raised prices. Rising prices increased hardship. Hardship bred unrest. The system offered no corrective mechanism because it was never designed to protect India's economy. Its purpose was to serve imperial survival. As long as Britain needed resources, the flow continued, regardless of the damage downstream. This strain reached a breaking point as shortages deepened. Food became harder to obtain. Transport systems prioritized military logistics over civilian needs. Warehouses filled with goods destined for export, while local markets emptied. The promise that balances would be settled later offered no comfort to those facing immediate deprivation. A credit, recorded abroad, could not feed a family at home. A future claim could not stabilize a collapsing market. The abstraction of finance collided with the reality of survival. The turning point was not a single decision, but an accumulation of consequences. As inflation surged, it exposed the fiction at the heart of the arrangement. India was not saving wealth for the future. It was losing it in the present. The longer the war continued, the less valuable the accumulated credits became. Inflation eroded their real worth. Currency shifts reduced their purchasing power. Even if Britain intended to repay them fully, time itself was diminishing their value. What looked like a growing asset was, in fact, a shrinking one. At this stage, the illusion of shared sacrifice began to collapse. The narrative of unity could not explain why the burden fell so unevenly. Britain was protected from the worst effects of wartime inflation by its access to goods and its control over monetary policy. India was exposed. Its economy absorbed shock after shock with little relief. When hardship intensified, the system did not slow or adjust. It demanded more. More exports, more compliance, more silence. Famine and unrest were not accidents. They were outcomes. When resources are extracted without regard for local needs, scarcity follows. When prices rise faster than wages, desperation spreads. When authority ignores warning signs, crisis becomes inevitable. The economic mechanism driving Britain's survival was also undermining India's stability. Yet within imperial accounting, these outcomes were invisible. Balance sheets recorded credits, not hunger. Reports measured output, not suffering. The system could claim success even as conditions worsened on the ground. Why would the flow stop? From Britain's perspective, it worked. Each year of extraction extended the war effort. Each deferred payment postponed reckoning. There was no immediate incentive to change course. The costs were externalized, absorbed by a population with no leverage to resist. This is how economic power operates when unchecked. It prioritizes continuity over consequence. It values stability at the center over collapse at the margins. As awareness grew, so did anger. The promise that post-war settlement would make everything right began to ring hollow. Trust eroded. People could see that their sacrifices were not temporary inconveniences, but structural losses. The credits accumulating abroad did nothing to address daily hardship. They became symbols of injustice rather than hope. What was framed as contribution increasingly looked like extraction. What was described as cooperation was revealed as coercion. The empire's war chest was now visibly full, but its foundation was hollow. Britain had secured the resources it needed to fight, but at the cost of legitimacy. The system that sustained victory was also accelerating the erosion of imperial authority. Economic pressure translated into political consequences. Discontent grew. Questions multiplied. The silence that once protected the system became harder to maintain. This was the moment when the true nature of the arrangement became clear. Britain was not merely benefiting from India's support. It was surviving because of it. And India was paying a price far greater than the numbers suggested. The imbalance was no longer hidden. It was embedded in daily life. The war chest that kept Britain afloat was built on a transfer of real wealth that could never be fully repaid. The turning point did not end the system immediately. The war still raged. The demands continued. But the illusion was broken. Once exposed, it could not be unseen. The narrative of unity lost credibility. The economic reality spoke louder than official statements. People could trace the line from distant decisions to local suffering. They could see how promises replaced payment, and how paper replaced substance. This chapter of the story reveals the true weapon of the war. Not tanks or aircraft, but accounting. Not conquest by force, but control by obligation. Britain's survival depended on a mechanism that transferred risk and cost outward, away from the imperial center. It was effective, it was efficient, and it was devastating. The cost was not counted only in currency. It was measured in hunger, unrest, and a collapse of trust that no ledger could record. By the time the war approached its end, the damage was already done. The balances remained locked. The strain remained unresolved. The question was no longer whether Britain would win the war. It was what kind of world would emerge afterward, shaped by years of hidden extraction. The empire's war chest had served its purpose. Now, it would leave behind a reckoning that could not be deferred forever. When the war finally ended, the fighting stopped, but the accounting did not. Victory did not erase obligations. It exposed them. Britain emerged on the winning side, but financially exhausted. Its empire stretched thin by years of total war. The war chest that had sustained survival now revealed its cost. The balances accumulated during the conflict did not disappear with peace declarations. They remained on paper, large and uncomfortable, representing years of resources taken without immediate payment. Britain faced a dilemma. It could not easily repay what it owed without weakening its own fragile recovery. And so, the settlement began slowly, cautiously, and incompletely. For India, the end of the war did not bring relief. It brought reckoning. The economy it inherited was distorted by years of forced priorities. Industries had been reshaped to serve imperial needs rather than domestic development. Trade patterns were warped. Reserves were trapped abroad, denominated in a currency whose value was eroding. Inflation had already done its damage. The accumulated credits, once presented as future security, lost real value as time passed. What had been taken in urgency was returned in delay, diluted by circumstance and policy. Even repayment could not undo the losses already absorbed. Independence followed, but it arrived into an uneven landscape. Political freedom did not automatically restore economic balance. The new state inherited structural weaknesses created during the war years. Scarcity had reshaped markets. Trust in imperial systems had collapsed. The financial tools available were limited, and the margin for error was thin. Rebuilding required undoing distortions that had been years in the making. The cost of survival for one empire had become the starting burden for another nation. For Britain, the aftermath marked the beginning of imperial decline. The war had been won, but the foundation of dominance had cracked. The empire could no longer sustain itself through quiet extraction on the same scale. Confidence faded. Global influence shifted. The financial center of gravity moved. What had once seemed permanent now looked temporary. In hindsight, the hidden mechanisms that preserved power during war had accelerated its unraveling in peace. This story matters because it is not confined to the past. The method did not disappear when empires faded. Power still hides behind currencies, debt structures, trade controls, and financial dependencies. Wars are still funded far from the front lines. Costs are still shifted onto those with the least leverage. Ledgers still decide outcomes long before soldiers move. The lesson is not abstract. It is immediate. Military power often rests on invisible economic coercion. Empires do not only conquer with armies, they conquer with systems. And when those systems are exposed, the truth is unsettling. Someone always pays. Sometimes in real time, sometimes years later, sometimes without ever being fully repaid. The question is not whether this happens, but whether it is recognized, whether the books are opened, whether the quiet rooms are finally seen for what they are. If this story reshaped how you understand history, subscribe to this channel. And if you believe these hidden mechanisms still matter today, share this documentary so others can see them too.